How do I know what time to use for dehydrating? How do I know how long my food's gonna last? Do I have to vacuum seal? Do I have to use those pouch things that go inside? What happens if my lid breaks? What do I do with this? How do I do that? Those are the questions I get about dehydrating all the time, and I have your answers here. Hi folks, it's Darcy from the Purposeful and today we're talking about some of the common questions I'm asked about dehydrating from questions from you. The first question is from Kelly. What is the first dehydrator you ever used? My first actual dehydrator was a Nesco FD80, which is the square Nesco. It's not very popular, and I don't know why, because it's probably the best of the Nescos that I've ever used. It's a workhorse, but unfortunately I got rid of it quite a few years ago when I got an Excalibur, and then I started collecting dehydrators, and it was like I can only have so many in my house at one time, and I wasn't using it often, and I wish I'd kept it, because since then I purchased the Nesco round FD75A. I really prefer the square one over the round one, and would like it for what I use the Nesco for usually is putting out outside to dry. So I really prefer, of all of the Nescos that I've used up to this point, the square FD80 was my favorite. It's my first. Maybe I just have a passion for it because it was my first dehydrator, but it was a great machine. It is a great machine. You can still get them. I'm just not sure why people don't go after it. All right, the next question is from Mary. How did I get started dehydrating? I got started dehydrating out of necessity. When we were young and married, and new babies were coming into the play, I was a stay-at-home mom. Our plan was that I would homeschool and I would not work, and we were pretty tight for money and for a very long time. And so I found it was just a necessity to figure out ways to save money, to make the groceries that we were buying last longer, that I could get better use out of them. I froze a ton of stuff. I was like the queen of freezing back in the day, back when once a month cooking was a big thing, and freezing those meals, and that you could just do it 1 day or 2 days out of the month and have all this food put aside. But I found that wasn't always the best means of preserving food for me, partly because we live in a part of the country that is prone to tornadoes and power outages in the summers from rainstorms, and I just knew that the freezer wasn't the best option for long-term storage, and I was too chicken to can. So I started researching. I was on all the frugal websites, and I started seeing people who dried things, and it was like, what is this? And when I figured out that, or when I realized that I could put food on my shelf that typically I would have frozen, that would let me start storing up food. If I would find a great sale, I wouldn't have to worry about freezer space. So I started dehydrating. And I am still a very basic cook. I'm not a cook who does these elaborate meals. I still create pretty basic meals, but so much of what I cook, I can use my dehydrated goods for, and I don't have to worry about having stuff on the shelf or having to go to the grocery store to pick up vegetables that I probably have dried someplace. I still do freeze. I still have a freezer full of food, but it's mostly for those things that either don't dehydrate well, meats, and I do can. I don't can a ton, but I do can. And I still, well, I said that I freeze a lot still, but dehydrating for putting away food for storage is still my favorite means of doing that. Okay, question number 3. How do you save over-dried turkey? I meant jerky, not turkey. That's gravy. But how do you save over-dried jerky? Basically what you can do, a couple things. You can break it up and cook with it. Just cook with it like you would any other kind of canned meat that you can make. Some beef and gravy on top of toast. If you guys know what I'm talking about, that's a great way to use it, because a lot of people used to use chipped dried beef. Basically it was jerky that they would make this from. They would rehydrate it and then put it with some gravy, put it on toast or rice, and it was a really inexpensive meal. Another way that you can save it is to powder it and have some beef powder that you can use to flavor things down the road. I do recommend that you store that in the freezer instead of trying to store on the shelf, just because proteins are not reliably shelf stable. You may be able to get something on your shelf and have it last for a while, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not reliable for that. So I would recommend putting it in your freezer, but it can be handy for flavoring broths, gravies, meals that you want to, kick up the beef a little bit from that meaty texture and flavor. You can use it that way. The other way that you can do it is for regular beef jerky that you want to keep as a jerky, you can put it in a zip tie bag with a damp paper towel and let it rehydrate some, and it will get softer. It still won't be soft like you might get from the store because they've done things to that jerky to keep it really soft, and it's also why it says once you open it, you got to put it in the freezer or the refrigerator because it's not meant for long-term storage, but it is a way to soften that stuff up to be able to enjoy it down the road later in the day. If you live in a really humid environment, you can actually leave it on the counter for a little while because that will probably suck up a lot of that moisture and become a little softer. But those are 3 ways. I'm sure there are probably other ways, and if you have a way that you would save old dry beef jerky, put it down in the comments below and let's educate each other on the other ways that you can do it. I'm going to interrupt our Q&A today for a brief commercial. It is the Black Friday Purposeful Pantry 40% off sale for all of our dehydrating products, which is the magnets, checklist, stickers, and the ebook versions of my dehydrating basics and journal. The physical books are not available for sale, but the ebook versions of all of them are for sale. They're all 40% off. You don't need a coupon. You can just shop right at the site right now. So thanks to the Purposeful Pantry for this sponsored part of the video. I'll leave a link for it all down below. Okay, our next question from M is, what's a good item for beginning canners? I am not well versed in all the things that there are canning because I can very specific kind of things and I don't do like a lot of things that a lot of people will do. But I'm going to say that chicken, if I could start over where I canned, the first thing I would do is chicken, because canning raw chicken is the easiest thing to do. If you can get out of the fact that chicken carries salmonella and you have to worry about, cross-contamination all over your kitchen if you're like messy like me and things go way off. Chicken is cut it up, stuff it in a jar, put it in your canner following the canning instructions, and that's all. You don't have to add broth to it. You don't have to pre-cook the chicken. You don't have to do anything else but cut it up into pieces, stuff it in a jar, and can it. That's what I would always suggest for a beginning project. I know many of you might have other canning projects that you think are super simple. And for me, anything that I have to spend time preparing before I ever can just adds more steps into the I'm going to mess something up down the road. So stick with something that's really simple. You can do broth. You can do chicken. Like things like carrots are pretty easy. Those things that are just simple and you don't have to have a lot of worry about the ratios of things that you put in, like some soups that you have to worry about how much solid versus how much broth or liquid goes into it. But if you have an idea of what you think is a really super easy canning project, stick it down in the comments below. The other thing I like about chicken is that I find it more versatile for anything that I cook than I do many of the vegetables that I might put up. Because I'm the only one in my family who will eat soup, I don't bother putting soup in a can because it just isn't worth the time for me when I can freeze it and I'll eat it within the next within a month. I usually don't let stuff sit like that for a long time. And I know that the freezer is not good for long-term storage, but for short-term, I'm good with it. So that's how I do it. Okay, the next question is, let's see. It was a question about temperature, and I get questions are revolving around temperature for dehydrating a lot, so I'm just going to kind of put them all into one big question mark. Okay, first, recommended temperatures for dehydrating will vary from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which is kind of the guidelines that I follow when I teach. They will vary with the manufacturer that you use for your dehydrator. It will have different temperatures within its manual to say what you should dry it where. You will find people all over the internet using different temperatures for everything. Ultimately, temperatures don't matter except in 2 cases. Proteins, which you have to keep the temperatures up high enough to make sure that everything is safely dried. And if you want to keep a raw version of the food that you're drying, then it needs to be kept below 115F and 46C. That's one I just can never remember. So the recommendations here that I have on my stickers and magnets are recommendations. They're not set in stone that you absolutely have to follow this temperature for everything that you ever do. Proteins, yes, keep it up high enough so that you're safe. If you want to keep it raw, you want to keep all the nutritional benefits from it, you need to do it under 115F and 46C. I usually recommend doing under 100 if at all possible. Now, some people have dehydrators that only go in 9-degree increments, like they have a digital one but only does 9-degree increments. It doesn't necessarily do 10. I'm at like 1 degree increments. Or they've got a dial that's like low, medium, and high. So what I suggest is always go lower on the ones that incrementally don't have the same number as what you see recommendations for. So if I say that you need to dehydrate citrus at 125, because I do recommend doing those lower than what a typical fruit temperature is, but yours only goes from 121 to 128 or something, go the lower. I mean, always drop it down, because yeah, it might take a little bit longer, but drying a little lower, a little slower gets you a better overall quality for your dehydrated foods in general. Now, I'm not going to say that for every case ever, but usually going a little lower gives you more nutrient retention, and it gives you a better quality in the end, because you don't run into over drying the outside, not getting the inside dry enough, which is called case hardening, and you just have more benefit to do it lower. Proteins, keep it up. Okay, keep it up where it needs to be. Now, where does that vary? It can vary at all. Okay, if you live in a very, very humid climate and you put something on your machine that's very moisture laden, like let's say that you live in the subtropics or the tropics, and you're putting an orange on your dehydrator, or maybe some blueberries or blackberries, and the moisture level in your house, if you don't have air conditioning, is always really high, and your machine can only do so much, and you've got all this moisture in the air, it wouldn't hurt for you to run a little higher than what the recommended temperature might be in order to help move some of that moisture up a little more quickly. Okay, that way that you don't run the risk of a really low temperature and high humidity having something mold on you in the machine, because that can happen. I've seen it happen with people who do purees, who do them too thick, and dry it really low, and it just sits there. Or they let the machine, they turn the machine off at night and turn it back on during the day. Overnight, you can start getting mold on those kind of things. So it's okay to run those a little higher if you need to, just to help keep that air moving across it, get it dried out faster. If you're doing things for snacking versus things for storage, you can increase the temperature a little bit to get them to dry faster. You might get vegetable chips that are a little crisper. That's okay to do as well. The thing is that when you run some things a little too hot, you lose more of the heat sensitive nutrients like vitamin A and vitamin C. The longer that you run it at a higher temperature, the more you're going to lose. But if you're just snacking and you're looking for the crisp more than you're looking for the nutrient retention, I cannot say that together, can I? The nutrient retention of just the vitamin A and C, then, make that decision for yourself. Now, yes, you're going to lose those two vitamins more than pretty much anything when you're dehydrating. But for the most part, everything else stays. So you don't need to worry about, what you've been told, that dehydrating, you can lose up to 50% of the nutrients. That's not actually true. There are some things that can affect it, like blanching things ahead of time. If you blanch them too long, you're also losing the water-soluble vitamins in that. And cooking it then at too high of a temperature, you're going to lose some. But overall, if you dehydrate properly, you're not losing much of anything except for the vitamin A and vitamin C. And I think I've gone on a tangent about temperatures. So what I wanted to say was temperatures are something to be aware of. There's something to kind of to stick with, but they aren't so set in stone that you absolutely must dehydrate your vegetables at 125F, 52C, or you're going to ruin them, because that's not true. Now, the benefit of drying lower, better nutrient retention, less chance of case hardening, a better overall quality, but that doesn't mean that you can't dry a vegetable at 135. So, a case in point, a tomato, which is a fruit, but we call it a vegetable. Where would you dry that? Either way, it doesn't matter. You can dry it at 135, you can dry it at 125, 57C, 52C. Ultimately, the temperature doesn't matter. They are guidelines that we have found over time. These are the best temperatures to use, but your situation may vary and you may need to do something different. So as long as you're not drying proteins at too low of a temperature, and you're not trying to dry things like berries and those kind of fruit, or even vegetables, in some cases like corn, those that are all enclosing, so like a berry that has a whole case around it, that you're drying it at 165 to get it dry fast, but you've not broken the skin in any way, that will be a case hardening alarm going off, because it dries the outside, not the inside, and then you can run into problems in storage because it might mold. So I hope that answered your temperature question. Everything you wanted to know about temperatures, they don't matter for the most part. Asterisk. Your mileage may vary. That kind of stuff. All those caveats I could add to it. Doesn't matter. Okay, let's see. Another question from Lynn is, do I dehydrate potatoes and do I prefer it over canned? Yes, I dehydrate potatoes. I just haven't done them for the channel yet. And I prefer them over canned 90% of the time. Now, my husband really likes canned sliced potatoes. If I take them out, and the commercially canned, because I've never done them in my pressure canner, I've only done chunks. But he likes the sliced canned potatoes that I will fry up in the frying pan with some butter and a little bit of oil and get a really crispy edge on them, and on the inside they're really soft. He loves that. I can't produce that at home. I've never really been able to produce it at home very well by myself, so I always buy the commercially canned ones. But I find that dehydrated potatoes are more versatile for me in the way I cook than canning potatoes. So there you go. Yes, I do dehydrate potatoes. I don't prefer them over canned. I prefer dehydrated more. And yeah, there'll be a potato video coming. I'm not there yet. Okay, now question number 7 is another one of those conglomeration kind of questions. It's, why isn't my food dry and what did I do wrong? Food drying times are so varied and so variable, and so dependent on so many things, which is why they're variable. I never, ever, ever give times for anything. Here's how you should look at time. It doesn't matter. It's relative. Your timing is going to be affected by your machine, the power of your machine, how you've loaded your machine, where you have your machine set up, what you use to line your trays with, the food that you've prepped. How did you prep it? Did you overload it onto trays? Did you blanch it before time? Did you blanch it for too long and it's really waterlogged? Did you break the skin? Did you cut it small enough? Did you cut it thoroughly enough? Those things. What's the humidity level in your home? Because if you live in a high humid environment inside, it's going to take longer to dry. If you live in a very low humid environment, it will take less time. Let's see what else. Power of your machine, the moisture level of your food. If you pick it in the morning after you've watered versus at the middle of the summer afternoon and it's had a chance to dehydrate on the line, on the bush or in your garden. But all those things affect how long things take to dry. So what I usually say is that vegetables can take anywhere from 6 to 18 hours. Fruits can take anywhere from 12 to 36 hours or more. Jerky can take anywhere from 4 to 8 to 10 hours. Those kind of things. Herbs can take anywhere from 4 hours to 3 days. It depends on what you have and what you put in. So my advice to you for this for time is the same as temperature. It doesn't matter. Just dry things until they're dry. You can be concerned if you have something that should have taken only 12 hours and you're on day 3 and it's still not dry. And don't go by the time as that's the time it's supposed to be done. But if you know something should be done within 6 to 12 hours and you're on day 3 and it's still not dry, you may actually have a problem with your machine. And that's when you should start doing some troubleshooting as far as looking at the manual and seeing what is one of the things they might suggest. You can take an oven thermometer, put it in your machine, close it up, turn it on, let it run for like a good 20 minutes, quickly pop out that thermometer and look at what the temperature is. It may not be the perfect 125F that you see that you've set it to, but if you're really close, then you know that it's at least working as far as heating up the air inside. If you set it to 160 and you're trying to do that, but it's only reading at 100, you may have a problem with your machine, and so you might need to talk to your manufacturer. Now, if you're not heating at all, then obviously there's a problem, and it may be there may be a just lost the word for it. But there may be a problem with the thermometer itself that you can actually replace parts. You may need to contact them to get a replacement of your machine. I mean, those are things that might happen. But generally, when people ask me what are time and temperatures, I will give them a temperature. I will not give a time. I will give a very large window of opportunity that your food may be dry, but your mileage will vary. It may go shorter. It may go longer. It just depends on so much. So be prepared that when you put food in that dehydrator, set the timeout for like ages. I usually set mine out for at least 24 to 36 hours, and even if it's only going to take 8, because I just don't look at the timer. What you can use that timer for is to remind yourself to go check the food. And that way you know, I need to remember that it's in there. I need to remember to go check it, especially if you're like me, that you have your dehydrator someplace like my laundry closet here. Because I use a Kasori more than anything, it's very quiet. With the doors closed, we often don't ever remember that it's actually running. So set the timer to use it to remind yourself to go check your food, not that your food is going to be done. Never expect that timer to tell you your food's done. The timer tells you that time has passed and I've turned the machine off. That's all it really does. So times don't matter, okay? Times are in the air. They're relative, it's going to be done when it's done. That's what you can know. Okay, the next question was, what is in my dehydrator right now? Currently, my dehydrator has nothing in it, and in store is spinach, celery, and kale that are in the refrigerator now, but we've had a small family emergency that I'm about to disappear for, so I don't know if I'm going to get it done in time. I'm going to throw the greens into my freezer. I may even just throw my celery in whole and deal with it when I get back and let it thaw. Throw it through the food processor and just grind it up into bits, and then put it in the dehydrator at that point to know that I've got that going. Greens are one of the most often used things in my dehydrator that I have. I go through so much green powder that we go through greens a lot. So if I can get them on sale at the grocery store in those little bags that have a little clearance sticker on them, I grab all that I can without clearing out the shelf and bring them home, and that's what I run through. So that's what's in my dehydrator, or what's going to be in my dehydrator soon. I may go ahead, if I have time after I'm done with this, I may go ahead and get them prepped and put them in. My family can watch them for me and know how to turn it off when it's ready and kind of know what to do with it. Okay, the next question is, can I use rice instead of moisture absorbers to keep my food from clumping? You can, but it doesn't work as well. My experience with this has been rice is used more as a declumping mechanism more than it is a moisture absorbing agent. So when you see it at restaurants and salt, it's used because the salt is open. It's not like it's going to stop moisture. What it's used for is you can shake it and it helps break up the salt so it doesn't clump. It does have a small moisture absorbing property to it because just like when you cook it, it absorbs all that water and gets really soft. But it doesn't work well for moisture absorbing the way you might need it with dehydrated foods. It can help break up clumps more. You can still use it if you'd like. What I find is that there's very few things that actually need a moisture absorber, and here are the ones. If you live in a humid environment and every time you open that jar, a lot of humidity is getting in because you're looking at 60-70% of humidity in your home all the time, you might want to use moisture absorbers then, because that helps reduce the moisture in the jar once you close it back up. You may have some foods that are prone to it. No matter what you do, no matter how much you try to protect it, it's just going to clump because that's the nature of that food. I would use a moisture absorber with that. But I find over time I'm using fewer and fewer moisture absorbers, even because I don't need them. They are a tool, but they are not a necessity. So I won't use rice because if I feel like I have to use a tool to help preserve my food, I want to use the right tool for the job. They are cheap. They are rechargeable so that it's not a one and done kind of thing like oxygen absorbers are. So I invest in a bag of moisture absorbers that I will use, and I will reuse them forever. Not forever, but they will be reused a lot. So I don't feel the need to use rice. But if you want to, if that's all you have access to, it's fine. It's just, it doesn't work as well, but it will work. So there you go. Okay, our next question is, it's a question I get asked a lot. Is there a chart to tell you how much water to use to rehydrate food? And how do I know how much water to add? There is a chart put out by one of the freeze-dry companies, and I can't remember the name of it. I want to say it's Horizon, but I don't think that's right. It's a chart on how much water to rehydrate their food. It doesn't work the same way as with dehydrated foods. They need different amounts. But in general, what you should be doing is that if you're dehydrating a meal that you need to rehydrate later to have as a whole meal, you need to weigh it before you dry it, weigh it after you dry it, make a note on your bag or on your box or in your dehydrating journal that you created with this right here. You can make a notation about how much water the difference between the before weight and the after weight is how much water plus a little extra that you should put into it to rehydrate. I find that for meals, that's what's necessary. For everything else, it doesn't matter how much water you use. What you want to do is put it in a container that you have enough water to cover it plus a little extra. Let it simmer on the stovetop. Let it soak up in the refrigerator overnight. Putting it into a super stew and just letting it go there, and add a little bit more water if you need to. For the most part, water the amount of water doesn't matter as long as you've got enough water to cover your food. Usually that's enough. And if you have a little extra water left over when it's rehydrated, put that in your meal, because that is broth, and so don't waste it. What I find is the more pressing issue for people when they're rehydrating is that they don't think about the fact that it's rehydrated, but it still needs time to cook. So I can rehydrate a jar of celery, which I like to do in the refrigerator. Let it sit there for a couple of hours with water. It will rehydrate. But if I didn't fully cook that celery before I dried it, usually I just blanch it, so it's just 3 minutes or so. It still needs time to cook when it's in a dish, or it's going to still be hard. So give yourself time to rehydrate and cook, not just rehydrate, because you're going to need that extra time. But I just find that I either put it in a simmering pot on the stove with some water, let it simmer there, and don't just put boiling water on, because I find that, especially if your house is cold, that gets cold pretty quickly, and then it doesn't rehydrate as well. So I put it in. If you're trying to get a short term, then I will put it in a simmering pot of water, because I find that works better, or into a super stew that has a long time to just sit there and simmer. That works best. Okay, I hope that helped. You, of course, can measure anything that you work on. You can do the before and after and know how much it took out for that cup, how much water goes into it. But I find that's just picky. For me, it's not worth that amount of work. I do more by volume, about how much whole, how much dried is equal to this, so I know more conversions for cooking with than I worry about the water that I use to rehydrate it. Okay, our next question is the why don't you questions. Lots of them. I always get, why don't you do it this way? Why don't you do it that way? Why don't you vacuum seal? Why don't you use Mylar instead of those jars? Why don't you do it this way? Most of what I do is by experience, by my preference for my home, by what we've found that works the best in general, but your situation may always vary. I do not vacuum seal 95% of what I put up anymore. I find it's not necessary. If you properly dry, condition, and store in jars that are the right size with airtight seals, or in containers that are airtight, whether you use jars or whether you use Mylar bags or whether you use plastic, whatever you use must be airtight, and it must be about the same volume as what you put in there. So you don't want to put this much food in a jar that's this big and expect it to stay well. So as long as you dry properly, condition, and then store in a good container, you're good. You don't need to vacuum seal. You don't need to use an O2 absorber. Those of you who are putting food away for 5 or 6 or 7 years, use an O2 absorber if you want, because I can see why the benefit might be there for that, because you just want to be sure. However, for most foods with dehydrating, optimally it's good 2 years, because then you start looking at the possibility of the food starting to degrade, starting to lose more nutrients, the texture not being so great when you rehydrate it to use. Your mileage will vary on this as well. You may find that you have something that lasts 3 or 4 years and it's just fine. Others of you may find that, especially with fruit doesn't quite last as long as regular vegetables do. You're going to find that you have times that are different, but the optimal storage to make sure that you have the best nutrition, the best rehydrated texture after is about 2 years. Plus or minus some time. So I find that I go through things faster than that. I don't intend to keep my dry food storage for 5 years, because if I'm going to do that, I'm going to invest in freeze-dried foods instead, because those are meant to last longer. And then store on a shelf and I don't have to worry about it. So these things are going to move within 2 or 3 years at the most. And so I just find that I don't need anything in them because I properly dry them and store them. Now, does that mean you can't use them? Use them by all means if you want to. There is no rule that says you shouldn't or you should. Just do what you feel like you want to do at your home. Another thing that I get a lot is my vacuum seal broke on my jar, or is my food ruined? No, it's not ruined unless you see mold in that jar because you didn't get it dry enough in the beginning, or you live in a really humid environment and you didn't have the ring. Hold on a second. So when you vacuum seal, and you vacuum seal and store your dehydrated foods just like this on the shelf, if this seal breaks, So let's say it breaks, okay, and you've got it on the shelf and this is all it's holding your lid on. That's not airtight. So this lid is not airtight on its own. So what you're doing is allowing moisture and oxygen to rotate, to seep into your jar, to come out of it, which is what that means. Airtight means no air transfer at all. If it's not airtight and it's just on like this, and you didn't store it with the ring to keep it on, then you run the chance of, moisture and oxygen being introduced and reducing the effectiveness of that food. And you also risk moisture. So when you store your dehydrated foods, keep your rings on. Just in case that seal breaks, then you don't have to worry about it. That way, this is still airtight. Stuff is not going to happen to it, and you don't have to worry. You can still vacuum seal. You can always re-vacuum seal. The seal can break for a number of reasons, but if it breaks, it's not a big deal because you are already airtight and it's good, okay? Don't worry about it. It's fine. And so if you have questions about dehydrating, please leave them down in the comments below because that way I can answer them for you this week as I have time. And others will probably chip in and give you their answers as well. And that's what's great about this community is that we all help each other out to learn how things are done. The way I do things are not necessarily the way that you do things. And sometimes you can get an idea based off the way somebody else does their stuff. So that's great. If you would like to see what I've done lately, some pumpkin powder right here, because that's been one of my favorite projects to do. I do it every year, a year's worth of pumpkin powder, usually every fall. I've got a video right here for you. And until I see you again next time, happy dehydrating.